We filmed them. Then everyone who saw that film disappeared. My name is Elmer Reid. I am the grandson of Thomas Reid, the man who taught me how to read a ridge like a weathered page, and how to let a forest tell you its small, honest truths. What follows is not an obituary or a boast. It is a reconstruction, as faithful as memory, and the scraps of paper and film I kept will allow. I write from the place where the archive is thin, notebooks browned at the edges, a handful of negatives, a rusting film can marked reel 2, and an audio cassette whose last minutes, my last minutes, bleed into static. The dates most of these records bear fall between 1977 and 1982. That is where we lived with Cora and Threy, and where we learned that witness is a dangerous thing. We found the prints in late September of 1977, on a morning so sharp the light cut shadows like vellum. Vince and I were 3 days out from the trailhead, crossing a thawed meadow that smelled of musk and old leaves. The impression sat in the mud like a palm pressed into history, 17 inches from heel to toe, deep enough to catch my thumbnail. The dermal ridges were clear. Skin, not just an outline. The toes, 5, spaced, ended in blunt pads. Something had walked there the night before, and it had not been the lumbering, imprecise scrape you read about in the papers. These prints carried weight and intention. Vince knelt, the Nikon F slung over his shoulder, and cleaned a bit of mud with the corner of his cotton bandana. He measured them with my grandfather's calipers. Thomas had given me that set when I was 20 because he said a man who could measure was a man who could tell truths. His handwriting in the margins of one of his journals had a line I still hear. Measure twice, trust the land once. We measured twice. The prints were consistent, spaced for a gait that was steady, not running. We followed. Tracking became an argument between skill and humility. You let your boots fall into your own prints. Feel the land with the soles of your feet instead of the eyes. You do not rush to close distance. Over 3 days we found a line of prints that moved like a sentence across the valley. Across a beaver meadow, through a creek that had eaten a narrow channel, past a stand of silver firs where the bark looked as if someone had braided it. Sometimes the prints wandered, looped, as if whatever had made them pause to consider the bushes or the sun. At dawn on the 3rd day we crested a small rise, and there, set into the long moss of a hollow like a nest, were the first shelters. They were not crude. At first glance they would have been mistaken for windfall and brush. Only when you walked closer did you see the architecture. Woven frames of alder and cedar, bark overlapped like roof tiles, a tight mat of woven sedge for a floor. A small, chimney-like cone of river stone suggested a hearth. Near the doorway, arranged with a care that made me think of someone setting a place at a table, were objects. A sharpened flake of metal, a strip of hide, a bundle of roots tied with cordage, and a piece of worked bone almost like a comb. Someone had organized their life with hands that knew how to tend tools. We camped downwind that night, not for conquest, but to listen. Vince slept with his camera under his poncho, fingers curled as if the shutter might twitch in his dreams. I opened Thomas Reid's worn notebook and read through the margins he'd left. Notes about places where men had seen things and recorded them as monsters because they didn't know how to be small and listen. My grandfather had been part naturalist, part storyteller, and what he left me were tools for both. How to record what you saw without drowning it in a need to prove. The first night their breath was a thing like a presence under the stars. When you are alone with the forest, its noises are ordered. When something else adds its pattern, the whole symmetry shifts. We heard a sound like a low hum threaded with a cadence, a voice that was almost song. Twice a pair of eyes reflected my headlamp and vanished. Vince made a soft gesture, a hand on his chest, palm flat, the universal, ridiculous human plea that has worked with some wild things and failed with others. There was no answer that night but the rhythm of sleeping animals and a wind that smelled of wood smoke. In the morning we found signs that the occupants had come closer. Hair, coarse, long, caught in a snag. Small feathers arranged like currency. A circle of tiny stones laid into the dirt as if to make a small altar. Nothing violent, nothing threatening. I felt for the first time the heavy distinction between what people call beasts and what we were seeing. Intelligence threaded through gesture, and the deliberate ordering of things. I wrote a sentence in my notebook then, and stuck to it. They are not the absence of culture. They have their own. Vince never used many words about what he'd seen in Vietnam. He carried them like a weight in his chest, the way a backpack holds a canteen and a photo folded soft. His photography was precise because his life had taught him that if you blinked, you might never have a second chance to prove you had been conscious. At first he photographed everything: the cut bark, the layout of the firestones, the odd bundle of root preserved with resin. He worked in black and white film, careful with light and shadow. Later he told me that taking pictures was an act that allowed him to file chaos into the drawer, labeled understood. He wanted the world to agree with what his eyes saw. We took our time. We marked the boundary of their paths with knots on tree limbs and mapped water sources on the inside back cover of Thomas's journal. We set small, humane traps for food it was safe to leave: apples, salted jerky, a tin of baked beans. Then, the first time we made a real, unignorable contact, it came on terms that were neither ours nor theirs, but something between. It was late afternoon, the kind of light that smudges color into sepia and makes everything feel like an illustration. I had perched on a fallen log where I could see the shelter openings without being seen. Vince was 10 paces to my left, camera cocked but folded to his chest, his breath steady. I had a small cloth bundle in my lap, a strip of smoked deer tongue Thomas would have given us because he thought curated food was a language. We had discussed at length whether to leave food at the edge and withdraw. We both decided no. We would offer and stay within sight, because fear of the unknown felt less honest than presence. A movement at the edge of the light and then the slow stepping figure that makes the spine cold when you see a human shape, and it is not wholly human. Kura came first, larger, with a dignity that made you want to bow without thinking. His face, if face is the right word, was broad, bone-crowned with a crest of hair that hung in thick rope-like locks. His eyes were set wide and rimmed with a brownness that held calculation and patience. He stooped to the food without quickness and then, raising one hand, he did a thing that would come to define our relationship. He flattened his palm and showed us the lines along his fingers. It was not a mimicked human gesture, but a mirrored offering. Hands speak. We answered with hands. 3 came after, smaller, younger, with a kind of nervous energy that danced at his mouth and in the quickness of his hands. He examined the cloth bundle. His fingers, capable and gentle, found the smoked strips and held them like treasure. 3's face, almost elfin, curved into the beginning of a smile when he tried a piece and let out a sound like a soft chuckle. He ran his hand along the fur of his own arm, and then tapped his chest where our clothes opened to sky as if announcing, "I like this." We didn't move to touch. Instead, we offered. We laid a small knife, a human thing, a gift, at Kura's feet, wrapped in a corner of burlap. He picked it up with curiosity, and then placed it beside him as if setting it within a new category. Tool, not threat. He showed us, with the knife in his hand, a notch he had been making on a piece of wood. It was not our achievement he was marking, but time, knots and cuts like a calendar. The exchange was slow and ceremonial, and so profoundly respectful that neither of us could look away. Contact turned into cohabitation in small, honest steps. They did not let us into their shelters at first. They let us sleep in an old prospector's lean-to farther down the creek, furnished with a ground sheet and the smell of wet canvas. We were not equals yet. We were tolerated with a distance that held a thread, an invitation that could be widened. Over the first winter we traded chores without language. We would gather water. They harvested roots and taught us how to find the tender tips beneath the packed snow. We repaired a leak in a wall with a patch of bark Kura showed us. He had an eye for the grain of wood that made him more craftsman than brute. Our biggest discovery came when Thray, who proved to be both curious and impatient, took us into the mouth of a cave one rainless afternoon. He moved with an ease in the dark that was almost a rebuke to our clumsy torches. Inside the cave, the walls blossomed with images, charcoal lines, ochre smears, layered paintings that began as simple handprints and rose into scenes. Faces, both theirs and something older, were etched into stone. There were images of people with tall, two-bladed things overhead that we recognized as rotors long before our modern minds had names for such machines. Scenes where figures crouched and others fled. marks that looked like nets and snares. These images were not simple drawings. They were an archive, a history that spoke in symbol and in grief. I realized then that what we had stumbled into was a living museum. His hands flew when he showed us certain panels, an image of a childlike figure hiding behind a rock, a line that indicated pursuit. We traced the charcoal, and the motion of the strokes told us the direction of a story of being watched, tracked, and sometimes hunted. Kura held a particular panel as if it were a testament. He touched it with the knuckles of his hand, and then reached to us and placed his forearm against ours in a pressure that was both plea and instruction. Remember. The most unsettling part of that gallery was an image of men in helmets, small stick figures with equipment, and above them, a rectangular box from which lines radiated. Perhaps a camera, perhaps a trap, perhaps something else. The images were layered, older images painted over with newer ones. The cave was a palimpsest of encounters, some friendly, figures exchanging foodstuffs or sharing a woven mat, and others violent. I could feel the age of each handprint in the stone when I ran my palm along it. There was a weight to the line where a child's hand had been placed centuries ago, the texture worn by time and reverence. Vince stopped sleeping at night. He kept photographing the cave, Super 8 reels and stills, and in the mornings he would sit with his head in his hands, and not speak. Sometimes he would look at a photo and say only, "They remember." He had a way of capturing the plaster-like grain of the stone and the soft shadow in an eye, and in those images you could see a mind thinking, not behaving on instinct. Kura made marks in the soft earth like a map when he wanted to show us something. He did not use language like ours, but he had pattern, and he taught us to read it. We moved into what might be called trust over the next year. Not love, not in the cinematic sense, but a daily intimacy built from the work of sharing space. We taught 3 how to use a metal scraper to make a finer line in his drawings. He taught us how to fashion a spoon from the root of a birch. He learned from Vince the idea of framing, the way a picture could say more than what it captured. 3 began to arrange his drawings on animal hides and tie them, little books of images. Kura showed us the careful storage of dried meat and the layout of a root cellar he had dug into the slope. He rejected our offers of canned food, but accepted dried herbs and the way we salted a hunk of pork. He showed us the way of a path that led to fresh water and the meander of deer through the alder. Those years were not romanticized. They were often cold and hungry. They were peppered with small cruelties of the weather and the large cruelties of human economics. The price of supplies rose. A town grocer changed hands and grew suspicious of tramps with film canisters. Vince started to carry a small pistol we never intended to fire, more a comfort than a weapon. I argued about it with him until one night he told me, quiet as the wind through the hemlocks, that the thing he feared was men more than animals, that the kind of men who would put a price on an unknown creature would find ways to make paperwork look like permission. He had seen it in Vietnam, agreements signed with bloodless ink and a disregard for life rendered as collateral. He became fiercely protective, a sentinel who would rather stand between the valley and some imagined man than between it and the creatures who had offered him a way to breathe. We kept a careful archive. In the notebook where Thomas had once sketched a broken compass, I wrote slanted entries, dates, weather, the pattern of movement. Vince kept 2 cameras, a Nikon for stills and a Bell & Howell Super 8 for motion. The Bell & Howell was a wind-up motor that made a thin, consistent whir. You had to be careful with it because any extra jolt would ruin a shot. We labeled each film can by date and scene. On March 12, 1979, a reel reads, Kura and Thray, shelter, food exchange. On another, later, reel 2, a label in Vince's hand says simply, third drawing panel. The film chemist in the nearest town, an old woman who worked under fluorescent lights and the smell of fixer, developed our negatives with a kind of reverence. She told Vince once, "These look like the only honest things I find these days." He said nothing to that, but her words lodged in him like a splinter. Despite our growing reverence, we also felt the gnawing sense that what we knew could not be kept forever. There was a moral question that sat in the mouth of every night. Is witness a gift or a threat? Thomas, in his journals, had recorded a similar dilemma in the margins of a page about an encounter he'd had when he was younger. He wrote, "To know is to risk. To keep is to forgive, and to hide. To tell is to burn. It was his adage that often grounded me when the cold and the fear made decisions feel like sand. I began to see that our presence might be a hinge. We could be caretakers and co-conspirators, or we could be heralds who would unleash a tension that could not be controlled. The first time we saw evidence of outsiders, we dismissed it as pockets of memory. A flattened circle where a helicopter had freckled the underbrush years prior, rotor marks in moss. A series of rusted cans arranged like a stakeout. Paper, brittle and yellow, that had printed a flyer for a hunting club with a crude sketch of what it called a wild man. Someone in that printed ink had already named them. It felt like an incision. Three's drawings on that day took on a frantic quality. Lines sharpened, the strokes showed motion. Kura paced the shelter rim in a way that suggested sleep would no longer come undisturbed. We started watching for rotors. They were rare at first, black silhouettes in the high sky, distant and small. Then one summer afternoon, as if the world had decided we were worth the trouble, a low thudding came. It was muffled by trees but unmistakable. Vince and I froze as the noise threaded the valley, and then resolved into shadows moving over the ridge. We ducked into the alder, and the hair on my arms lifted like I'd been poured into a cold vat. Kura and Thray, who had been sitting near a waterhole, rose in unison. Kura made a sound, low and rumbling, and Thray's small hands went to his face in a pattern Kura had taught us to quiet ourselves. The helicopter passed without landing. We watched its belly as it carved a black hole against the pale sky, and then the trees swallowed it. But the very fact of it was a disclosure. It meant someone had flown this region, had an interest. It meant the cave murals were not only memory, they were warning. I remember sitting by the creek that night with my notebook open and writing, without ornament. They are known. Someone knows enough to look. After that pass, the mood shifted from a winter of gentle trust to a season of vigilance. We moved caches, buried film cans deep beneath river stones, wrapped maps in oiled cloth. We agreed, in a kind of quiet treaty, to stop leaving obvious signs when we left the shelter. We burned the occasional chicken bone instead of leaving it to rot. We taught Kura how to hide the entrance of his shelter with a veil of moss. They watched us when we worked with a patience that was disconcerting, like students learning a ritual. There was calculation in their learning, and that made me think again about whether they had always known the shapes of threat or had been taught by hurt. Not everyone in town was kind when we made the rare, cautious trips into civilization for supplies. We learned to be circumspect with film canisters, to avoid making the curious into clientele. Yet the world presses in. You cannot live forever at the lip of society. On one run to town, Vincent overheard a man at the hardware store mention a reward offered for unusual pelts and proof of rare animals, in a tone that made Vince's jaw tighten. He came back from that trip pale and quiet. Later, while developing negatives, he handed me a photograph with the negatives ghosting in the emulsion. A woman with her face half hidden had clipped a notice from the paper and taped it inside the counter where the film dried. On the notice, small type read of an anonymous grant for confirmed biological specimens of unknown origin. It was enough to set a trap in men's minds where curiosity could too easily turn to commerce. I think sometimes that the choice to record it all is arrogant. You coerce a moment into being what you believe the world needs, and in doing so you change the thing you mean to show. Yet we were not researchers in lab coats. We were part of the valley now. We had traded stories in silence. We had been shown where the water ran cool. We had repaired broken tools and been given, as debt and as bond, the access to a cave that kept a people's memory. To not try and make a record felt like theft. We argued about it heatedly one late fall by the low fire. Vince leaned forward, hands on his knees, camera sitting between his feet like an altar. "We prove this," he said. "We don't publish it. We don't shout it from rooftops. We make a record. If something happens, if they get taken or if they decide they don't want us, they'll know. We'll leave evidence that we were here and that they were not animals." I could see his fingers curl into the leather strap of his camera. His voice carried a strange steel. "And if we don't?" he asked. "What then? They vanish, and the story dies. No one will know. And men will keep calling it myth while someone else, some man in a pickup, decides it's worth taking." He had a point. The cave gallery demanded testimony. The images on the stone needed witnesses in a language the modern world respected. Film. We said we'd be careful. We said we'd ask for consent. We said all the right things because we lived with the creatures, and because we had begun to love the way their hands arranged a camp. Kura, when we told him about the idea, tapped his chest slowly and looked at us as if weighing whether such a thing could exist in his world without collapsing the life he had patterned with silence. It is not that they could not refuse. They chose to hold the possibility of being seen as a burden and a gift. Thray, in his childlike generosity, leaned into the notion of it with a naivete that broke my heart. He wanted what any young artist wants, the world to understand his lines. Kura, older, more cautious, seemed to feel it as a stratagem, a way to make a statement, or maybe a way to leave a mark before time took more from them. We agreed to prepare. We would teach them the mechanics. We would show them how the camera whirred, how light burned film, and how a still photograph was like a pressed leaf, a piece of time flattened but held. Vince started with small lessons, laying his hand over Three's as he clicked an empty frame and wound the bell and howl until the motor's heart hummed. Three's fingers learned the rhythm: press, wind, press. And he let out a delighted sound each time the strip spun. Kura was more reserved, watching the aperture like a scientist watches a flame. He tested the weight of a tripod, the balance of a lens, nodding as if these were stones to be placed in a cairn. We practiced lighting, soft candles, a reflector made of tin, the use of flashbulbs that popped like small stars. We showed them how the film reacted to brightness, that a too bright light would burn an image into nothing, and that a dim light might hide features. It became, for a few weeks, an education in vulnerability and in command. I remember the night we tried a mock portrait. Three sat upon a stump with a strip of painted hide around his shoulders, and Vince adjusting the lens as if setting a trap for truth. The camera whirred on the wind-up motor, and the shutter clicked. When Vince advanced the film and handed us the exposed can, Three rubbed his palms together in that small, elated way and grinned, an expression that sits in my chest like a photograph I can't locate. The moral calculus did not become lighter because we rehearsed. If anything, rehearsing made the question colder and more precise. We were making tools to expose what a world might not protect. But the pull of saving a history, of leaving a transcript on film for anyone who might read, was strong. We owed the cave and the knotted cords and the careful storage of roots more than we owed the notion of secrecy. The valley was generous in moments after that. Long runs of quiet where deer stepped like punctuation marks, and the work of community continued. But the air itself seemed to have been marked. A small thing at first. A piece of string tied to a distant branch in a color that didn't grow here. Then the larger things. An unmarked man in town asking questions about strangers who took to the mountains. We kept our guard without becoming paranoid. We kept our reels buried in riverstone and in the hollow of a fallen root. We kept our notebooks hidden within the seam of Thomas's old trunk. We kept, in short, the documentation that would one day be called evidence. If you are listening and the idea of men vanishing because of a film seems melodramatic, I ask you only for patience. Witness is costly. The more you fold the world into your language, the more the world folds back. You will see why, how men who were once indifferent became sources of risk, how a photograph might become currency. But those scenes lie ahead. If this story is the kind you want to hear more of, long, patient things that let a mountain breathe, then stay with me. If you want more deep dive stories like this, hit subscribe. After that summer and the tentative lessons with the camera, our lives narrowed into two rhythms: the life of the valley and the life of the ledger. The ledger was the archive we kept in Thomas's trunk. Dated entries, film canisters labeled and double-wrapped, a small contact sheet Vince would make in a darkroom he borrowed from a friendly chemist. The valley life was more fluid, food shared in silence, the meticulous repair of woven roofs, the teaching of a new gesture for safe that Kura made by aligning his palms to his chest and pointing to the sky. We learned their songs, not words but music, notes that curved and repeated like small stories. Sometimes under a raw sky we would sit with a makeshift drum, and Kura would hum a baritone line. Three would answer with a series of quick, flute-like breaths pressed between his lips. The songs were not decoration, they were memory. They mapped seasons and births, times of drought, Times the world had screamed loud with rotors over them. I tried to write the motifs down in the back of my journal, little slashes and circles that meant nothing to anyone but me and the creatures who taught them. We became careful archivists. 3 would draw and we would copy. Kura would point to a panel in the cave and then to a spot in the valley, and we would walk there and see the meaning of the two together. Once, when the snow had bunched in the hollows and the creek ran the color of iron, Kura took me by the wrist and led me to a place where old bones lay like punctuation. He showed me with a grave softness how bones could be arranged and rearranged into meanings, and he pressed his forehead to the stones as if to read an inscription. It was almost impossible to keep my mouth from saying what the world would do with such discoveries. I learned to listen instead. We had days of joy, through showing off an arrangement of leaves he had woven into a pattern that made the two of us laugh, Kura making a slow joke by hiding a medicinal herb in Vince's pack and watching his cousin sneeze, and days of dread when we woke to find a camouflage spot where someone had clearly been watching us in the night. Those days the world itself felt like an interrogator. Vince's eyes hardened, his shutter finger twitching even when there was nothing to freeze in the frame. He took to checking the perimeter at dawn, his boots moving with a soldier's surety. I thought sometimes that perhaps it was his training that made him vigilant, and sometimes that his vigilance made him more a soldier than he had been before. One afternoon in the second year, while we were sorting film in the lean-to, a scrawl of handwriting interrupted our routine. It was a note we had not expected, a photograph of a newspaper clipping that had been folded and tucked into a film can. The clipping was old and the ink had bled, but the headline was legible enough. Local huntsman reports, strange footprints. The body beneath the line was small and mean, describing a wild man seen near a logging road. A map had been circled with a shaky hand. Whoever had folded it had left the corner stained with coffee. We held that clipping between us like a thin thing that might cut. It meant that someone had once put ink to paper about our valley, and that the valley had been pried at like a scab. It meant that stories did not always remain private. It meant that what we kept would not remain ours if the right eyes found the right paper. We began to make plans that held both caution and stubbornness. The plan, such as it was sensible. Make a definitive record of Kura and Thray's life that could not be muffled by hearsay or by the mendacity of men who would make a market of a life. The record would be slow, consensual, and careful. We would capture their songs and their hands, their drawings and the cave as a whole, not for profit, not for spectacle, but as proof. Proof that might in some future world stand and say, "We were here." I do not pretend to be heroic. The decision was an amalgam of love, fear, and pride. We were exhausted by the knowledge that something rare and intelligent existed, and that our small human sigma might be the thing that protected or destroyed it. There are kinds of responsibility that appear at certain points in a life like weather. You can either take shelter or raise the flag. Vince, always quicker with equipment than with speeches, organized the logistics. Film stock, extra batteries for the battery-powered lamps, a tripod so large it would disgust the underbrush, and a bell and howl heavy enough to make my wrists ache when I tested it. He drew out frames from our stock and talked in the short, clipped sentences of a man who had learned to be concise in combat. "We don't show it wide," he said. "We keep the reels in separate caches. We only record what they consent to. We have to be perfect." Kura's assent, when it came, was not in words. He placed a palm against a slab of stone on which he had once drawn a rotored machine, then against the camera case, then against his own chest. It read in our language as a concession and a request: remember and do no harm. Three watched us with an intensity that made me think of children learning a dangerous lesson. He wanted to be seen. That was where we were when the valley tightened its jaw, and the first real sign of outside interest came down from the sky. We heard it before we saw it. The slow, mechanical suggestion of a rotor in the distance that made birds break like dropstones from the branches. I have a habit now of writing the small details because memory, like film, is punishingly selective. The way the light on Kura's arm picked up the dust, the way Thray's head cocked as if listening to an animal too subtle for human ears. Vince leaned toward me, his hand hovering over the camera motor as one might hover over a sleeping animal. We had rehearsed an exit strategy. We had caches and hidden paths. We had also rehearsed the idea of staying. That afternoon the valley gave us both choices. When the shadow cut across the slope and the rotors came into view, low, black against a white sheet of cloud, the world narrowed to the sound and the memory of strokes on the cave wall. I remember the oddness of sensation. It felt like someone had turned the lights in a house on and off. The helicopter circled once, then twice. It did not land. It left its echo, but it had seen. We watched it go, and in its wake the valley whispered with the old charcoal strokes. Kura's shoulders were a small earth moving under a fur coat. Three's hands trembled. Vince's face had gone hard and quiet. I think all of us felt the same thing. The knowledge that seeing is not always saving. It might be the first step toward exposure. That night, we sat with the archive, with the reels and the negatives and the cave panels layered on the notebook like plates in a surgeon's tray. We counted and recounted our measures like men who know that counting is a defense against forgetting. Thomas's handwriting gleamed from the spine of his journals. Measure twice. Trust the land once. I put my pen down and pressed my palm to the page as if to anchor myself to a footnote in time. We were tired, and we were afraid, and we were determined. Above all, we were witnesses. That truth would, in time, be both our salvation and our undoing. That truth would, in time, be both our salvation and our undoing. We set the date in the margin of Thomas's ledger, October 4th, 1980, because marking a day with ink feels like giving it weight. It was late in the season when wind eats at the last leaves and stone takes color like it is settling in for cold. We chose an overcast afternoon on purpose. Flat light is forgiving. Vince liked flat light for portraits because it let you see what was there without 1,000 shadows inventing features the subject did not make. We rehearsed the sequence down to the breath. Our plan was more liturgy than sortie. We would film in 3 parts. First a portrait session, stills, and a single slow panning motion to catch hands and faces. Second, a filmed walk through the cave gallery to show the sequence of panels. Third, a recording of the songs and a small exchange of gifts that would speak to their domestic life. We did not want spectacle. We wanted evidence of culture, hands that made, songs that told, eyes that watched and remembered. Anything else would be theft of a life. Vince organized the logistics with the quiet precision of a man who had seen things that never belonged in lists and still forced them onto paper. He counted bulbs, those small flash capsules that pop once and burn like a match, and wrapped them in waxed cloth. He wound spare film onto amateur reels, then onto reels he labeled with careful pencil. The bell and howl needed a smooth winding to avoid jitter. We balanced a tripod on 3 points of soft earth and tested its legs until they held steady. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the tripod looked like a small monument when its legs were splayed and dirt clung to its feet. We did not dress Kura or Thray. We would not have thought of it. They arrived as they always had. Kura with the slow, measured gait of somebody not obliged to nag his joints into motion. Thray with a restless collusion of joy and mischief. They approached the equipment with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Kura laid a palm on the metal case as one might lay it against a stone, careful, as if counting the durability of the thing. They prowled around the tripod like a cat, hands finding it and testing its balance. His fingers found the knobs and surprised us by understanding them almost at once. Consent, as we conceived it, was apace. It took longer than any of us expected because what we were asking was not only to see, but to be seen. We taught them the sound of the shutter and showed them how to wind the motor until the whir matched the pulse in your ears. Three laughed the first time the flash popped. It frightened him, then delighted him like a small animal discovering light. Kura watched, brow furrowing as if weighing the consequences of each burst. He touched the strip of film when Vince unspooled a bit to show him the texture. He smoothed it like a page. Vince had a ritual he used for difficult subjects. He set the camera down, removed his hands from it, and did not touch it again until the subject had accepted it. This was slower than necessary and smarter. It gave Kura the chance to approach on his own terms. Kura walked the circumference of the tripod twice, and then sat on a mossy stump about 8 feet from the lens. He folded his hands in his lap. He did not face us directly at first. He wanted to be observed but not framed like an animal in a zoo. We began with stills. The Nikon's mirror slapped and clicked like a heart that had learned to be mechanical. Each exposure felt like pressing a leaf between heavy books. I watched the way Kura's knuckles bent, the way the light caught the haft of scars at his wrist. 3, for his part, volunteered to pose with one of his small drawings, holding it to his chest as if offering a page of himself. Vince shot wide and close. He shot hands and faces, and a deliberate still of Kura's fingers around a bone comb. After each shot, he would quietly show the back of the camera, the ghost of the image shaking slightly on the screen, and 3 would clap softly when the frame pleased him. The motion reel was more complicated. The bell and howl has a sound only people who have worked with film can hear in their bones, a steady, thin humming like a distant insect. You have to wind it, then steady it, and, when you press the button, resist the urge to move. The slight twitch of a boot would ruin a horizontal pan. Vince practiced the rap of his thumb on the crank until the motion of the camera matched his breath. When he turned that crank that day, there was a softness to the pan. He followed Kura from the profile of his brow down to his hands, then pushed through to Thray as he hovered over a book of drawings. The lens remembered, the film remembered, and I remember my chest feeling like a drum. For the cave sequence, we used handheld lanterns and a battery-powered spotlight we had acquired from a miner in town. The light was wide and forgiving, but even so the caves resisted clarity. Images come out with a grain that translates into age, and age is its own honest proof. We moved slowly through the gallery, Vince's light sweeping the panels while I walked beside him, whispering the names of the panels as Kura tapped them. Kura led, and Thray trailed, occasionally touching an image as if blessing it. The final movement was a long shot held on a series of handprints layered like a family tree. The film turned those handprints into silhouettes like echoes. Finally, Vince set up a microphone to record the songs. We had a crude mic, capable of handling mid-range frequencies but ill-suited for the low baritone Kura produced, and we placed it between them and a small reflector made of tin. The sound came through thin and intimate, and there were moments when the tape hiss swallowed the breath and left only an impression of tone. There's flute-like answers threaded between Kura's low hums in a way that later, when I listened to the tape in the darkroom, made my throat close. It was music that had not been composed for us, and yet it accepted us into the shape of a line. At one point, mid-recording, Kura rose from where he had been sitting and walked to the trip case where we had left the small knife Vince had earlier given him. He set it down before the lens, and then placed his palm over it. We watched him not as object, but as expression. The gesture seemed to mean, in the language his hands had made, here is where we hold what is necessary. He did not hide the knife. He offered its existence to the camera as if the world must know what they had made and what they kept. When the reels were done, we wrapped them in oiled cloth, sealed them in waxed tins, and buried one under a cairn of riverstone by the old prospector's lean-to. We left a duplicate in Thomas's trunk because it felt right to keep a copy where the ledger had lived. Vince made contact sheets and slid one into a small envelope, writing the date and the location. He folded the paper like a talisman and tucked it into his pack. We left that night with more reverence than fear, and with the private assumption that the record would keep the memory even if memory failed. We had 3 copies. One buried in the valley, one in town with the film chemist who had developed our earlier work, and one in Thomas's trunk. Redundancy had always been our simple defense. The first thing to go missing was small, almost laughably small. A roll of exposed film labeled Reel 4, daylight portraits, an extra we had intended for the chemist. We found the can empty and the wax seal broken, but no sign of the film itself. The impression of a careful hand was there. Someone who knew how to break wax without leaving fingerprints. At first we told ourselves it was the raccoons, the usual suspects. Then we found cigarette butts in a place where there had been no campsite. Then we found tracks near the access trail that were not ours. A man in town who used to fix fence posts for a living told Vince, over a beer, that he'd seen a truck idling at the far end of the logging road one October morning, its bed covered with a tarp. He'd thought nothing of it until he read in the paper a week later about specimen buyers setting up a base in the county, a small front company phrase that tells more about economy than about method. We lived in a place where language often soft-pedaled the ugly things people did for wages. The phrase specimen buyer is one of those polite euphemisms that means men will reduce a living creature to currency. A week after the filming, the chemist's darkroom went silent. She had been a fixture, an old woman who worked under bulbs and fixer with an economy of movement that made every motion efficient. One morning she did not open her door. Her neighbor, a school teacher, went to check and found the darkroom empty, the trays dry, a cup of tea cold on the counter, and one contact sheet pinned to the board like an exhibitor's proof. There was a note in her handwriting folded and left on her table that read, "Gone for a week, don't look." It sounded like a joke at first. It did not age as one. We wrote letters that received polite acknowledgments and no favors. The sheriff in the county had the kind of patience that reads as disinterest. "People leave," he said in a tone that had no curiosity. "They take jobs. They move to care for kin. It is a mercy of bureaucracies to offer as explanation the smallest possible natural cause. Suspicion slides off like rain from duck cloth." The second disappearance was less forgivable in its bluntness. A man who had been a courier for a supply run, an acquaintance who'd once done us a favor by bringing sugar up to the lean-to, failed to come back from a drop. He called once, his voice thin with wind, saying there were men on the road asking too many questions. Then nothing. His wife put up a small notice in town. "Missing, Tom H. Last seen October 20th. We knew Tom. He was the kind of small man who loved trains and kept a pocket compass. When Vince went to the last place Tom had stopped for coffee, he found Tom's left glove on the bench by the highway, palm turned up as if offering something to the sky. There were, again, no signs of a struggle close enough to fit our moral imagination. The web of absence raveled in increments. First the film we had trusted taken, then a woman who developed film, gone, then a courier gone. The community in town, which is always a porous thing, began to whisper in small conspiracies. A man in a bar told Vince, with the kind of casual cruelty that is almost worse than intention, that science had buyers who paid well to private collections. He worked his hands as if counting bills. "There are markets," he said. "People with cold eyes and coins." Vince's jaw tightened when the man said it. He had never been a man to lie down easily. We tried to be careful. We moved caches twice, 3 times, so many times that our hands ached from digging and replacing the earth. I took to carrying only 1 can at a time, and not sleeping with it near my chest. But the more we hid, the more the pattern suggested that hiding was not sufficient. The sense that someone or someone was moving deliberately through the edges of our lives grew into a pressure that made the skin on my neck prickle. It was on a rainless night in November that the first direct confrontation happened. I was awake because the storm had kept the valley clear and you become unnatural in such quiet. I heard a noise, metal scraping, out by the lean-to. Vince, awake in the next cot, heard it too and slipped out without waking Cora and Threy. He came back in an hour with his face pale and hands like ice. "A truck," he said, "near the old Ford. 2 men with flak vests. They looked like contractors." We debated then on a knife edge of what to do. There were options, each worse in its way. We could leave and take the films with us, becoming fugitives by removing the thing we had vowed to protect. We could stay and risk discovery. Or we could do something in between, move a cache and let the creeks and rocks hold a truth. In the end, we did both. We took the prints and the contact sheets and a duplicate reel and moved them to a deeper cave behind the main gallery. One only Cora had shown me on a night with a blue moon. We left a small trail of meaningless scatters to confuse a search, and went about our days with a carefulness that felt like a new religion. Not all disappearances are dramatic. Some are the thinning of presence, a chair unread, a bed left unmade. For a time the valley compensated, but then the pattern of absence sharpened into the final shattering sequence. It began with Vince missing a supply run to town. He left early one morning with a pack and a list and did not return until dusk. When he came back, his hands were empty of sun, and his eyes were full of something he couldn't name. He unpacked in silence and set the groceries down like a statement. I asked him what he had seen. He would avoid my eyes. Finally he said, "They've put posters up," and he pressed a folded strip of paper into my hand. On it, a crudely printed notice offered money for authenticated proof of non-human specimens. Below that were names and a phone number with an area code that suggested an out-of-state purchaser. The phone number had been scrawled over, as if someone had tried to make it unreadable, then written again. That night we slept poorly. The valley felt like a hand whose grip was tightening. Kura paced the circle, and Thray made small nests of moss to calm his hands. We tried to talk rationally. It hardly mattered. Warning signs are not orders you can obey. They are weather, and you either take shelter or you don't. Then, 1 week after Vince returned from town, the chemist's niece came to Thomas's trunk and asked us if we'd seen her aunt. She had been looking for her for 3 days, and had found the darkroom window shattered and a contact sheet pinned to the board with one corner missing. The niece, a small woman with her face freckled like a map, had a look in her eyes that men get when the world is too big and they are too small. She asked questions that scraped at our conscience. We answered with a combination of fact and omission, because there are things you will not tell when the telling is a dagger. Our world of witnesses shrank. The grocer, who had once been neighborly, now watched us with a hawk's look. The county newspapers ran a small feature on mysterious disappearances, but filed it beneath a pager's shrug. Men I had once thought ordinary now had uncertain glances that read like debts. A couple of times while we were at the lean-to, I heard low conversations in trucks near the logging road, men talking about pieces and who paid. I could not say with any certainty whether these men were small-time criminals or hired hands for larger appetites, but the tone was predatory. The final disappearance that the valley remembers as the sharpest change began on a December night that turned white with frost. We had come to think of winter as a time that made the valley smaller. The long dark compresses the world into immediate things. Food, heat, the small gesture. We had been 3 days without fresh film. Vince had gone to the nearest town to pick up supplies. I had promised to stay and check the perimeter. Kura and Thray had come down to our lean-to to share a late meal. We had eaten by a small lantern and told stories. Not our kinds of stories, but the kind that lives in hands. It was at that hour, when the wind had settled, that a sound came. The low cut of a rotor like a nail through cloth. It was too close. We scattered like animals taught to scatter, some plan, some instinct. I saw the silhouette of a machine over the ridge, then a bright wash from a searchlight that turned the world into a theater. We heard voices in a low language I could not make sense of. Orders barked like dogs. I saw a man in the clearing with a mask and a rifle, his boots tramping the ground with the confidence of men who think the map belongs to them. Kura stood with his back to me, one figure against another, and I remember thinking the world had narrowed to a single hinge. Thray put his hands on Kura's leg like a child who knows a lesson is near. We left the lean-to and fled with the camera tins tucked against our ribs. We followed a path Kura and I had walked in brighter months. The forest soothed our running with its dark arms. When we reached the place where the old prospector's cairn had been, where we had buried one of the reels, there was no cairn. The stone lay in a scattered heap, and footprints smudged the ground like someone had walked through our prayers and decided they did not belong. We did not see the men. Men do not always leave a body for you to find. They leave an absence that gets curated into a rumor. What we found instead were small pieces, an empty tin with a wax seal broken, and a scrap of contact paper shredded where it had been hung, a cigarette butt with tobacco of a brand not sold locally, 3 sets of boot prints that led up into the trees and then stopped in a place where moss had been disturbed, as if a package had been airlifted. We spent the night in a hollow and listened to the voices of the sky. In the morning we returned to the lean-to to find that our pack, in which I had kept the ledger and the duplicate reel we had intended for the chemist, was gone. The trunk where Thomas's journals lived had been forced, the lock broken clean. It is one thing to steal a thing that is valuable, another to take a thing that tells. They had taken our telling. Vince did not sleep for 3 days after that. He drank coffee until his hands shook and checked the perimeter, and then checked it again. He called no one. That week he made a trip into town and returned with a look so small it hurt. He told me, in a voice that was actually a rundown of the events, that someone had been asking about men on the mountain and had offered a reward to anyone who could produce proof. He had confronted the man, and been met with a polite, cold laugh that read like a dismissal from a man unburdened by conscience. When our packs were taken, we were left with nothing but film that had not yet been developed, and some negatives that Vince had hidden inside the lining of the old prospector's coat. Hiddenness is its own religion, and we learned it quickly. We reburied what we could, shifted caches deeper, and relied on physical memory. How a path felt underfoot, the sound of a certain creek that sang in a particular register only at dusk. Memory became our map. Then, a week after the theft, Vince disappeared. He did not vanish in a way that the movies romanticize. He left one morning with a small pack, kissed my forehead in that blunt way he had, and possibly meant I was to go with him, and walked down the trail toward the logging road. I thought he would return by dusk. He did not. The trail showed his prints at the ford, then at the junction, and then stopped where someone had trampled it into the ferns. His camera strap was draped over a stump as if set down for a moment. There was a small smear on the ground that could have been oil or blood, and that is the precise cruelty of evidence. It allows more than one meaning. I could imagine he had been taken. I could also imagine he had left, deciding that staying was no longer an option. I spent 3 nights ransacking the places people frequent for signs. I went to the hardware store, the bar, the little diner where boys in town had once laughed with him over coffee. People said they had seen him move through the town, quiet. One woman said she had offered him a ride and he declined. Another man said he had promised someone he was going to look after the cameras. That the testimony was small and contradictory did not help. Each small contradiction widened the space of uncertainty. A month later, a post-it appeared on the bulletin board at the post office. Missing, Vincent Palmer, last seen December 12th. If seen, contact. A phone number was written beneath it. We called it for a time and the line was always busy. We left messages for people who might know. There were letters from people concerned and letters that wanted to buy whatever we had with an eagerness that reeked of commerce. The sheriff filled out forms that went nowhere. The world trimmed its edges in such a way that men could be lost without making much of a splash. The disappearance did not end with Vince. Over the course of the next year, people who had been connected to the Valley's testimony left one by one. The chemist's niece moved to the city for work and stopped writing. The courier never returned from a job. An old prospector who had once given us an anchor point for the trail died in a hospital after a fall whose details no one could properly reconstruct. A man who had seen the contact sheet at the chemist's shop came down with a sudden fever and left town in an ambulance in the night. Each absence felt like a thread cut from a cloth that was already thin. The valley after these events had a hollowed feel. The cave still held its panels, but the frequency of visits decreased until it had the rhythm of a museum closed to the public. Kura began to shift his shelters farther in. There carved fewer new panels, and instead mended the old ones with charcoal, and had them touched with resin to preserve them. He would sit for hours with a small bone comb, and his fingers would uncurl the old knots in the woven mat, the way someone might mend a page. There were nights when he would come to our lean-to and lay a small bundle of drawings at the edge of our cot, as if offering what remained. It is difficult, in a narration that aims for any justice, to balance culpability and mercy. I can tell you what I saw, and what I suspect, but I cannot tell you the full name of the thing that took people. There are threads I can pull and they unravel into possibilities. Private buyers who contracted men to gather kinds of proof. Hunters who mistook curiosity for permission. Nameless engines of commerce that see a creature and think in dollars. There is also the possibility that our friends chose of their own volition to leave. Kura and Thray might have decided to move farther off, to a place with no trails. Men, too, might choose absence rather than expose a people to harm. I cannot rule one out for the other, only offer what evidence allowed. What we did find, months later, the only thing left to us that seemed to have escaped all nets, was a canister with a piece of flaking wax inside, and a handful of negatives rolled into a corner of a tin that had been abandoned near a creek. It looked like a ruin someone had tried to cover with respect. The negatives were not whole. Some strips had been chewed at by water and roots, but there were frames that had survived the decay. On one of them was a still of Thray holding a drawing up to the light, his face half-shadowed, his smile caught like a small bird. On another was Kura's hand, large and folded, resting on a stone as if to show the grain. There was also a frame, one that I have not yet seen printed because printing it feels like opening a locked thing, of Kura and Thray sitting at the edge of the cave with their hands touching. The negatives had been hidden in a place where only the desperate, the careful, or the lucky would find them. We turned to the last piece of evidence I had kept. An audio cassette labeled in my own hand, Elmer, Notes and Last Attempts. It was an impulsive act at first. To speak instead of write felt like making a shadow that might persist. I recorded my voice to the tape in the empty hours and sometimes in the dark, hoping the sound would hold me steady. The tape includes 100 things. Weather, the cadence of a creek, a song 3 taught me in 3 breaths. It also contains the last minutes before the tape runs into static, and those minutes are the thing that binds this story together. The cassette begins with a dry rustle and my voice described, in a brittle way, the wounds. I spoke of the film, the chemist, the courier, the truck. The tape has my cadence where my sleep has been hollowed out by cold and fear. But the final minutes, the ones I cannot have forever because they go into the white noise of oblivion, are something I still replay like a wound to see if it can be read differently each time. On that tape you can hear the wind in the bunk as I move a reel from one pocket to another. I cough. I duck. I can hear in the distance something that could be a helicopter. I tell the recorder not to stop because I wanted the voice to keep being a proof that I existed at a certain moment. I say we buried the master under the prospector's cairn. I say where the duplicates are. I say who knows nothing. Then, with the tape still running, the audio changes. There is a rustle, a soft exclamation, my voice, a half sentence, spoken to someone moving close, and then a sound like a metallic zipper. The background sound crescendos, a rotor, or the scraping of boots, or perhaps the wind in something heavy. I say one line slowly, the cadence thick. If they come, don't follow. And then the cassette blanks into static. The tape ends on that static. It is both trite and unbearable to put so much meaning into a silence, but silence often has the last word. Years later, the archive was found. How it was found is its own small narrative. A neighbor's child found a tin in the roots of an old cedar where it had been burrowed and useless. The tin contained 3 things: a handful of contact prints, a bundle of negatives, and an audio cassette labeled 07, Elmer, 1979-1982. Whoever recovered it did not first go to the papers or to a phone. They took it to an archivist in a university who knew how to read film and handle tape. This is how the chest of fragments gets translated into story. The archive lists the items with dates we had written and with notes that we had left. Reel 2, Shelter and Food Exchange, March 12, 1979. Reel 3, Portrait and Cave Pan, October 4, 1980. Contact Sheet 3, Drawing Panel, 1979-1981. Audio Cassette 07. Field Notes and Last Minutes, dated June, 1982. Partial. There was, I should be honest with you, a small sigh of vindication when the archivist called to say something about the film having a grain and a humanity he had not expected. But that victory tasted like smoke. The film that exists, the copy that eventually made its way into a small circle of people who understood preservation, was not the whole story. It is a clean thing to watch. Kura's hand, 3's drawing, a pan of cave panels that shimmer like a memory caught and held. It is reverent because of how we shot it, and it is dangerous because of what it could do in the wrong hands. There were, after its discovery, people who sought to commercialize it, and people who sought to bury it. That these two impulses exist side by side is par for the course when odd things are found in the world. I have to be careful here. You will read headlines that will want to turn this into a conspiracy with a capital C and a villain with a backstory. There are certainly people who profit from material like ours. There are certainly men who think curiosity is a commodity. But there are also times when people leave of their own accord. When the archivist called me, he avoided conjecture and stuck to craft. Do the negatives have splice marks? Are there varnish cracks in the contact sheet? He is, like all archivists, more concerned with material than motive. The last thing in the archive, the final fragment of sound that refuses to dissolve into meaning, is the cassette I spoke of. When the archivist sent me a copy, he warned me that the last bout of static is dramatic, and that the tape hiss might be disturbing. I listened to it in a small house with locked doors and the smell of coffee. I could hear my voice, older in that little echo than when it spoke into my journal. It says, slowly and with a kind of care, "We filmed them. We did it because they asked us, and because we owed them a memory that could move." Then, breath. Then a rustle. Then the line that cuts. "If anyone finds this, remember." And the tape goes into the sound of machines and something like a long, high note sung by someone trying to be patient with fear. I do not know what happened to my cousin. I do not know what happened to the chemist, to the courier, to the men who were once small parts of the web. I have plausible accounts. Men who took profit for work. Men who fled because staying would mean exposing another life to violence. State actors of some kind acting in the shadows. Or perhaps no actor at all beyond human greed. I can only offer the artifacts, the reels, the negatives, the contact sheets, the audio with a last sentence that is not finished. I can offer the cave panels and the story they tell of rotors and nets and the layered history of a people whose name the world has chosen not to learn. I sometimes imagine Kura and Thray in a different place, farther back in the silent country where the maps fail. I imagine them making new panels, weaving new mats, and being careful to teach only the youngest how to cross certain streams. I imagine them rehearsing songs that are small enough to be ignored by men who fly, and loud enough to be understood by kin. I imagine a life that continues without the audience that demanded proof. There are those who will call this a cover-up and point at the empty places on our map as evidence. There are those who will point to the reels and say, "Aha, proof." But the reel itself is a fragile thing. Emulsion scratches, negatives fade, and people's memories reshape into fables. The truth resists being nailed to a board because truth, like a wild animal, will not always stand in place for the hand that thinks it has it. In the end, the archive is an argument we leave to whomever comes after. The negatives say, if you look carefully, hands, songs, drawings. The cave says, history. My notebook says, measure. The tape says, I was here and I tried. The photographs are not a full defense. They are an offering. You can choose to believe that the men who connected with that offering were taken for profit, or that they chose absence, or that a dozen other more complicated things occurred. You can choose to look at the film and decide it is a hoax, or you can decide it is an act of witness. I do not know whether there is a resolution that will satisfy everyone. What I know is this. The creatures had calendars carved into the wood, and the hands of their elders showed long use. They had a capacity to teach, to mourn, to store food and heal wounds. They had drawn rotors and men and lines of nets because those things happened to them, and because art is what you use to make sense of injury. If you watch the footage, you will see a panning shot that makes it impossible to reduce them to myth. You will see Thray's small drawings pinned like a child's book. You will hear a fragment of song on an old tape. You will not, from those fragments alone, be able to decide with certainty what was done to the witnesses. You may decide to follow one thread: blame, profit, fear, mercy. Each thread will have its own evidence and its own holes. That, perhaps, is the precise and cruel nature of this story. The last time I felt the valley in a way I could name was when a young graduate student from the university wrote to me and asked if I would help with further research. He had a box of prints and a digitized clip of the motion reel. He wrote politely, with the earnestness of someone who believes questions can fix things. I met him once at the trailhead. We walked for a while. He asked careful, kind questions. He asked where things were buried and whether I still had the ledger. I told him I had only fragments. He asked the one question everyone asks in some form: do you regret filming them? I thought of everything we had given and everything it had cost. I thought of faces on contact sheets and of the chemist's empty darkroom and of a small boy who had never finished his coffee. I told him then what I would tell you now. To witness is an obligation that does not come with instructions. All you can do is measure twice and trust the land once. Keep what you can and bury what you must. Protect the stories you are given by the best means you have. If you have read this far and want to see the items I have described, photographs, contact sheets, transcripts of the cave panels, and a partial copy of the audio cassette, there is a link in the pinned comment where the archive is cataloged. The material is incomplete and it is messy. It will not answer every question and it will raise others. Stay skeptical. Look at the negatives. Judge what you need to judge. Remember that the people in those frames were not curiosities. They were kin in a grammar of hands. The notebook entries end on a smear of ink and a line in my hand dated June 12, 1982. We keep the film. They keep watching. If the reels are found, remember the way hands move. After that note, there is only the audio and then the silence that closes this recording. If this is the last voice you hear, know that every word was meant to preserve the small things. The way a hand holds a bone comb, the curve of a child's drawing, a song that hums low like a vein under the skin of the earth. If you find yourself on a ridge looking down into the valley where we lived, do not bring a camera as proof and do not come to take. The only thing certain is that curiosity without care can become a net. If you want the source material, the extra photos, and a transcript of the cave panels I have described, see the pinned comment for links to the cataloged items. Look carefully and remain skeptical. There is no single truth here, only an archive that asks for thoughtful hands. Audio cassette, static, a breath, a half line. If anyone finds this, don't